Hey everyone, I'm Jack with riverjackstudio, and in this video I try my hand at wood carving some chunks of wood from trees that I harvested. So I had this walnut tree blow down in a neighbor's yard during a storm a couple years back, and I cut out some sections to use for some projects later on. I thought I'd take a break from doing some bigger projects like the butcher block I did in the last video, so I figured I'd try my hand at wood carving in this one. I needed to make a dough bowl for a wedding gift that would also make a nice centerpiece, and I also figured while I was at it, I would make another bowl to hold my keys and wallet. I'm always losing them, and I actually lost my wallet with my license, social security card, and insurance in it like a week ago, so I figured I should probably go ahead and train myself to put it in the same spot. This walnut has been drying out for around 2 years now by this time, and was under 10% moisture on the inside and out, so I was pretty well good to go. I grabbed my dad's baby Husqvarna chainsaw that he bought new in 1998, so it's literally a year older than I am, and I haven't managed to break it yet. Since this piece has been drying out and I didn't put any end sealer on the end to reduce the checking, which are those cracks that form when it loses moisture. Usually these don't go too deep, so I just cut off a couple inches on the end and get to a piece with no cracks. I then cut the piece that I was going to use that was around 14 inches long. After cutting my piece off, I stand it up on my sawhorse and make a shallow relief cut in the top. I then grab a maul and hammer and following that midline, splitting it down the middle to give me two pieces. I then grab a chisel and knock off all the bark, which comes off pretty easily due to the shrinkage from the trunk itself. The sawhorse that I'm using is actually called a jaw horse, which has a clamp attachment on the top which you can invert and flip around for bigger projects. It's really useful when wood carving or having big chunks of wood, and I use it pretty often out in my yard. I don't want to mess up my shop putting it in a vise or anything like that, so this is a pretty useful tool. I then needed to start out with a flat bottom and then work on the shape of the bowl from there. I head over and hot glue the piece down so it won't move on me when I take my router across the top. I make sure to put the bark side up and flatten it to give me a nice surface. I oriented it this way due to the natural shape of the bowl it already provided, and I finish off and take my router through with a flattening bit and run along until I reach the heartwood of the walnut to use as the base. In my first ever video on YouTube, I showed myself at my old job cutting up a cedar tree to get it out of the way for a controlled burn. In that first video I made a table, but I also grabbed a couple smaller branches and cut off pieces that I could use for other projects, including this bowl I'm about to make. I do the same process with this cedar piece and flatten one side, use the bottom. I now had both of these pieces flat and would start to carve out the rough shape. I use a larger grinder with a tungsten head from Cutsaw. It's got a whole bunch of really sharp pointed edges that will take off material pretty aggressively. It's the most aggressive head they offer, and it's concave for a bowl, so this is perfect for this project. I just start by giving it a rough outline by going around, and I kind of wanted to end up with a beefy dough bowl, so it was more elongated and make sure not to go too steep on the edges as I'm doing this. All of the membrane between the bark and the live edge comes off at this point. Walnut is really valuable for its workability and is usually characterized by its dark heartwood. Most people don't like to use the live edge part, which is the lighter section in color, but since I was making a bowl, I couldn't really take it all the way down and just use the heartwood because I would end up with a really shallow bowl. I actually really like the color contrast, so I just kept the sides of the bowl tall and made the dish quite thick at the bottom. I then carved out the center of it, because where I split the wood, the pith was still present, which is the very center of the tree and is usually pretty hollow. So I went ahead and carved that out and made the bowl about 4 inches deep. I ended up just working back and forth trying to take an even amount of material on each side, and I would lightly go over all the edges to take out some of the deeper gouges and even everything out more. I then moved on to my cedar piece. I had to be pretty careful here when wood carving. Not only is cedar a much less dense wood, it also is more prone to checking. And because this was a cookie cut and not linear, it was strained from drying out radially. So I made sure to keep this bowl as thick as possible so it wouldn't completely split on me. Literally nobody uses cedar to make bowls, and it's pretty much just used to either make closet liners or chests due to the insect repellent and aromatic qualities. The heartwood on cedar is incredibly pretty though, and depending on the finishes, it can be anywhere from a dull pink to a deep red. Eastern red cedar is native to much of the eastern United States and is not actually a cedar, but is in the family of junipers. Red cedars can often be found on fence rows of farm property and along roadsides, as it's known as a pioneer species. A species that quickly gets introduced to a disturbed landscape, whether that be fire, wind, or in this case, just meaning changed, so often along farmland. Because of this, you will often see cedars on edges of forests as well. Usually, pioneer species are fairly short lived, unlike eastern red cedar, living just long enough to provide habitat for the next generations, this being hardwood forests that will eventually emerge and take over these cedar thickets. The reason red cedar is so successful at coming into these areas is its quick growth rate and need for full sunlight. Carving the cedar piece goes much quicker than the walnut just because it's such a light wood. It's also a pretty funky shape, so I just follow the natural lines to make it work. I've now got a rough shape for both these bowls, so now I'll move on to sanding. Normally after I use the heavy disc, I'll switch to a disc that's a little less aggressive. But since these pieces are so small, I decided to just go ahead and take a grinder and use a 36 grit flat disc. I go over all the deep gouges on the walnut bowl and get most of them out. I then grab my orbital sander and starting out at 60 grit, I go over the whole bowl, making sure to evenly go over the flat bottom so I don't round it over and make it wobble later on. I then spray water in between the sanding grits to pop the grain, which also makes it a lot easier to sand the funky shape that it is. I then move up to 80, then 120, 180, and finally 220. And then I occasionally have to break out the small grinder attachment to get the corners of the bowl just because I can't get my larger orbital sander in these tighter spots. In total, to split everything apart, flatten, shape, and sand the dough bowl, it only takes about a half a day. Let me know if you all are interested in a bowl below. I have 4 of these logs that I had cut up in total, and I could probably make another dozen or so of these bowls and can put them up on my Etsy. Some more fun plant facts, because I'm a giant nerd and this was my degree. Black walnut, which is the scientific name Juglans nigra in the Juglanaceae family. Some fun Latin for you all. It's also a pioneer species, similar to other hardwoods like silver maple and black cherry. It's often found on roadsides, and like the cedar, it's shade intolerant, and it needs to be dominant if it's going to survive in these mixed stands or in forest conditions. Eastern gray squirrel's diet is roughly made up of 10% of the walnuts that are derived from the tree, and because this is the primary method for seed dispersal as well, from the squirrels burying these nuts. Black walnut is also really well adapted to fire due to its general durability and thick bark, at least in the eastern side of the state where we don't have large forest fires. So I now start on the cedar bowl, following the same methods I used for the walnut one. The only difference is the speed and force which I use my palm sander. Cedar will pit really easily and it shows the sanding marks even when you use the random orbit feature. So I make sure to thoroughly go over everything and blow off the debris in between sanding and go over any of the areas that I missed. As you sand further and further up the grits, you can really start to see the character of the cedar really start to come through, and see all its quirky features, including all the individual growth rings. Like I mentioned earlier, in my first ever video I posted here, we removed the tree because it was directly in the way of a fire lane, which is used to control the spread of a burn. The tree also had a dead top, which was of concern to us when prepping for the burn, so we decided to go ahead and cut it down. I wanted to kind of showcase my work doing land management and also get to use some of the pieces for personal projects. I often don't see people harvesting their own wood sustainably and then getting to use it on projects as well, and I thought it would be neat to show you all sustainable harvest and give some inspiration for projects along the way. I get done with sanding the cedar piece and now I was ready to finish both the bowls. I needed to get any dust before applying the finish to see any areas I also missed as well. So I took mineral spirits and a microfiber to remove any of the dust and show any imperfections that I had in the wood. I then let it sit for a day and came back and added my finish. Using Odie's oils, which is a wax finish. Normally I would use Rubio Monocoat to finish walnut, but it's pretty pricey stuff, and this is so small that I figured it would be okay just to use this wipe on and wipe off application of Odie's. Also, because this would probably have food coming into contact with it, like rinds of fruit, or even if they did actually use it as a dough bowl, I needed it to be food safe, which Odie's oil is after the full cure time. You can really tell the difference between the heartwood and the live edge on the walnut after applying the finish. I was really happy with how the color and just how deep and dark the brown got in the center of the bowl. Especially towards the ends, you can really see all the growth rings. I did the same thing with my cedar bowl. Usually when I see different finishes on the same type of wood, it gives a pretty similar look overall. Obviously this excludes stain. Cedar is a big exception though. Literally any finish you use looks different day to day. When I think it's really cool though, because you can end up with a totally different color scheme just by using different finishes. Also, because cedar oxidizes so quickly as well, if you literally wait a day or two to apply the exact same finish, it will look so different. Along with the walnut bowl, let me know if you guys want any cedar bowls down in the comments. I can probably make at least 100 of these things. I have so much cedar left over that I packed in the back of my truck after that burn, so I'll never run short of cedar anytime soon, and I sure won't run out of any projects either. And the finished products. Thanks everyone for watching. I'd appreciate it if you all liked, comment, and subscribe for more woodworking content. Down in the comments, let me know what you think, and I'll see you all next week.